Okay. Interview between Brian Charland and Oberon Zell-Ravenheart on December 23rd, 2018 in Salem, Massachusetts. So I appreciate you meeting with me. I actually do have a copy of the questions.
I do. I have my copy here.
Sure. So to begin with, about how many members are in CAW?
Well, I just checked with our membership coordinator when you asked that question, and right at the moment we have 333 official members.
Nice.
at this particular moment.
You say official members.
All right. Well, people have actually filled out a membership application.
Okay.
There's many levels of membership. Like any church, a lot of people may just come and show up and hang out and be a part of it without actually going through the formal filling out a membership application and paying dues kind of process.
Sure.
But we have no idea who those are or how many there are. So.
Sure. Are most of them in California? Or?
No, all over the world. We've got probably our biggest group is in Australia, actually.
Really?
We've got a huge contingent in Australia. We were the first legal church to be incorporated in Australia other than the Anglican Church.
Wow.
So it was a big deal
Yeah.
to get there. We did it through some interesting little legal loopholes as registering as a foreign corporation, which was recognized because we're a legal corporation. And got in under that, and there we are. That was done in, I think, 92, I believe, is when that happened.
Nice. So how many members, your headquarters is in California, is that correct?
Well, yeah, world headquarters is
Base
officially
nest, I guess?
registered.
What would you call that?
Sorry?
Your basic nest?
Oh, well, you could say it that way, but we don't really use that term to refer to the headquarters. We just refer to headquarters because it's not really so much a physical place. All the official, we have an agent of service there that we have to be legally registered. But we don't have an office per se.
Sure.
We did when I was out there, but right now everything's in storage. So, and it's in storage in California and some of it's in Georgia. So, because that's where people are. And right now I'm on the road, so I've got a bunch of stuff with me. But all the main files and everything which were in our offices are now just in storage. But it's all online stuff, so it isn't really.
Sure.
Those are just backup documents and paper stuff.
Sure. Can you just tell me a little bit about how you started the Church of All Worlds?
Sure. Well, officially, the Church of All Worlds got its official start with the publication of a science fiction novel called Stranger of Strange Land by Robert Heinlein, which was published in October of 1961. And it was the culmination of a series of juveniles, as they're referred to, that Heinlein wrote, 12 of them, during the 50s. And it was sort of like the Harry Potter series of my generation, is that every year there'd be a new one out, and the protagonist would be like a year older, but it wasn't the same protagonist like Harry Potter. There would be another story about another kid who would be a year older than the kid in the last story, and this went on for 12 years until eventually it got to the point where the protagonist was in his 20s. And that story, okay.
Sorry to interrupt. You guys all set?
Yeah, I know very much. You?
Can I get the fried haddock?
The sandwich or the dinner?
I get the sandwich.
The sandwich?
Right. I'm going to go for the fried calamari starters thing.
All right.
Okay.
Just the crispy calamari?
Yeah.
All right.
That's good.
I can grab this.
So I kind of grew up on those. That was my my mentorship, because the stories were all about what it means to be a human being, and there were lessons, they were much like the comic book lessons that we get, what it means to be a hero, to do the right thing, to be a good person, and all that kind of stuff in the context of science fiction, just like the Harry Potter stories are about it in the context of fantasy magic. So in 1961, the culmination of this whole series was Stranger of Strange Land, and the theme of it was the story of a kid who's born on Mars and raised by Martians, because the entire first human expedition to Mars crashes and everybody's killed, but one of the women was pregnant, and the ancient underground hidden society of Martians discover the wreckage and are able to save the baby and raise him up. But they're not human. They don't know what it means to raise him up as human at all. They just raise him up among them, Like we go to the jungle and bring back a baby chimpanzee and raise it up in a home and teach them how to talk with hand language and do things and stuff like that, and wear clothes and ride bicycles or whatever, you know. You know, it's like that. And that was the concept. Imagine what it would be if a human being was raised completely from birth by a completely alien culture with very different abilities, perspectives. And so 20-some years later, a second expedition succeeds, gets there, finds this kid, you know, and brings him back to Earth. And after a period of adjustment to things like gravity and other conditions, his alien perspective starts percolating out. First, the nurses and the people who are working with him and the people in the expedition, you know, are talking with this kid and getting his ideas and stuff. And as the whole story unfolds, we become a part of that community of people who are hanging around this really unusual kid and getting his perspective. And it turns a mirror on everything that we think we know in our society. You know, and for the first time in science fiction, issues of religion and sex and relationships and politics are addressed in a science fiction story. Not just flying around in spaceships and encountering alien cultures, but our own culture seen from the outside, you know, from an alien perspective. And yet, a strangely human one. I mean, the kid is, after all, technically human. It's a marvelous concept, a brilliant concept. And in the process of this whole thing, the kid ends up having to create a church because everybody wants to gather around and hear what he has to say. It becomes a whole thing. So he founds a church, and he calls it the Church of All Worlds, because that's the point, to include all these perspectives. Well, among the people that he's been talking to and influencing, even on the expedition, are people from different religions and cultures, you know, Christian, Muslim, you know, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever, you know. And so all of these things get discussed in the mix of it all, and trying to bring the threads and what are the commonalities and the truths and the wisdom that can be found in all of these, and how do we deal with the contradictions, and so on it goes. It's a brilliant book. It totally shaped the entire culture of the 1960s. It's widely regarded in the reviews as the most important book of the era, you know, because it influenced so many people in so many ways. And well, it influenced us. So the central right of the thing is the sharing of water, because water is a rare commodity on Mars, so it's a very precious thing to share water. It's like with you know, the old Native American thing of becoming blood brothers. You know, if you share blood, you know, you cut your hands. So the sharing of water is like that. It's a pledge of kinship. So and it moves throughout the entire story. You know, I offer you water, I share water. Water shared is life shared. You know, we are one kin, ye and I, to quote Rudyard Kipling. You know, so the book came out as a science fiction book club book of the year in October of 1961, and my best friend in college, that was my first year in college now. After growing up in the 50s in Pleasantville, I went off to college in the 60s. So it was like archetypal things, you know. And for the first time, I met somebody else who seemed to be of the same species as I was, because I was one of these alien, changeling, mutant kids, you know, who didn't feel I belonged, you know, the ugly duckling, the weirdo, you know. A lot of us felt that way, you know, and we were all isolated and alone, and I used to go out in the backyard with a flashlight to try to signal the flying saucers to come back and take me home, you know, that kind of stuff. Alienation was sort of the byword of that whole generation. And when I went off to college, I started meeting other people like me who had felt the same way and grew up the same way, and we bonded really tightly. And my first one was a guy named Lance Christie, who had come from Oklahoma City, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, to college, and I'd come from Chicago area, so we were from different parts of the country. And there we were, all together. And he got the book because he subscribed, and he read it over Christmas vacation, and he came back and he said, this is all this kind of stuff we've been talking about and all these perspectives, because we were totally, you know, thinking of ourselves as aliens, strangers in a strange land, is how we all felt. And so he gave it to me to read, and I read it over spring break, over Easter vacation, because it fitted in with my studies. And on April 7th of 1962, Vance and I sat down in a field and pulled out a canteen and poured ourselves a cup of water and shared water for the first time. And that was really the beginning of the Church of All Worlds. And we, over the next few years, we shared the book with other people that were cool. And there's an interesting little story about that, if you don't mind a little digression. Lance and I both went into the psychology department, and at that particular time, in the 1960s, the big new thing in psychology was transpersonal psychology. It was just coming to market, and prominent in that was the writings of Abraham Maslow, who was trying to develop a psychology based on models of health as opposed to pathology, because all the previous psychology models were on pathology. All right. Thank you. Yes. And could I have that other sauce that you have, the kind you have for the oysters?
Cocktail sauce?
Hmm?
Cocktail sauce?
Not the cocktail sauce. That
Horseradish?
No, there's a kind of an orangey, kind of a salmon-colored sauce that you do.
Yep, the river one.
That's the one. I love that stuff. Can I get some of that? So, Maslow has come up with 15 points of different characteristics that were indicators of health. Things like autonomy and, oh God, I don't remember all of them. There's a whole bunch of them. There were 15 of them in 3 different main groups. And a hierarchy of needs, culminating with self-actualization, starting with the very basic, foundational survival stuff, And you get that down, and then you kind of move up. Creativity comes into place, and you got time for this. Thank you. All right. So, right at that time, a guy named Edwards came up with a kind of a test. Everything's great, thank you. That he called the Edwards Personal Preference Survey, EPPS, and it was designed that if you answer these questions, they would then be able to rank you on 15 different scales in 3 major categories, each of 5 scales within them. Well, Lance and I were smart, and we got sort of recruited to be the student assistants in the psych department. And the first assignment we got in these eras before computers was to go through all of these, because they decided to give these tests to all the incoming students that year, for the first year. So all the incoming freshman students had to take this test. Well, and we got to grade the tests for everybody. So naturally, we did what anybody would do. We looked up our own first. And we noticed in the central set of 5 that we had a matching M-shaped thing. Low this, high that, low this, high that, low this. High in things like autonomy and creativity, and in low in things like, following whatever people said, things like that. So we thought that was kind of cool. And as we went on, we noticed that the vast majority of the students had a W in that same place where we had an M. We call it the Westminster W because it was Westminster College. And we thought that was interesting.
So you were the exact opposite of everybody else?
Right. Except every now and then we'd find another M. Well, we looked those people up. We took notes of who they were. We looked them up on the campus. We got into conversation room. We handed them this book. Say, I think you might like this book. They'd come back and said, wow, that's fantastic. We'd say, there, share water. And by the time we graduated, 4 years later, we had about 100 water brothers in our little community of people who were all bonded around this stuff, and we were getting together and hanging out and doing wonderful stuff together, and it became quite a little community. We called it ATL, A-T-L, because we wanted to be cool, and ATL was the Aztec word for water, and it also has a esoteric meaning of the ancient lost homeland of our ancestors. And we're thinking, Atlantis, and all this stuff. So, that was a very cool term.
Sure.
So we called it the Outland Brotherhood, and us as Outlans, and so on. But at that time, we were using kind of the fraternity model as kind of a secret underground little society we had and stuff. We all took magical names, put out a little newsletter, but everything was on the public on the campus. So we discussed controversial issues. The first such that had ever been on that campus. The first underground radical newspaper. And we put that on, called it the Outland Torch, and we discussed all kinds of things, but all under our magical names. Mine was Prometheus. If you know the legend of Prometheus, you can get this reason. And we did that all the way through college. Then we graduated and went off to graduate schools. And by this time, we'd had a really wonderful nest, really tight. One of the themes in the story is polyamory sequence. So many of the people in the nest were bonded with each other in love and sex unions. So we had a bit of that, which was really wonderful. So we're a very tight group. And so we went off to continue our lives in graduate school at different places. I went to St. Louis, graduate school at Washington University. And we started sharing our communication by what are called apozines. That is, everybody writes a letter and sends it into one central place where it gets reproduced, and then copies of everything get sent to everybody. And I was the one who doing that. Everybody would send me their letters and things, and I'd type them all up and put them all together and staple them out and send copies of them. And the discussion became, should we remain a kind of a secret underground society, or should we go public and let people know that we're here? Because in the story, the Church of All Worlds in the story is pretty secretive for quite a while, but eventually becomes public. But when it does, it exposes themselves to serious, kickback, and eventually angry mobs come and burn the place down, and kill the founder and all this stuff. It's quite an intense persecution thing that comes out of this. So there was a warning in all of that. If you become a pink monkey, the other monkeys are going to come and tear you apart. So there was a considerable debate around this. Should we stay secret underground or should we go public? Right around that time, a book called The Herod Experiment came out. It had
The Herod?
The Herod Experiment by Robert Rimmer. And it hypothesized a kind of a college environment where a group of people in it came together and formed a tight bonded as a group marriage kind of a thing, and then went off to do secret work behind the scenes, and they picked some low population state where they could get involved in various influential positions and help to shape things in a positive direction. And there's a whole description of this in the appendix of the novel. So we were talking about both of these models, to go public as the Church of All Worlds or to stay secret. So we did both. We continued the Outland Society, which became the Outland Foundation, and eventually, and currently, the Association for the Tree of Life, ATL. And Lance was sort of selected to head that up, and then we decided to go public with the Church of All Worlds. And say, okay, here we are, because those of us who wanted to do that felt that it meant a lot to us to find that we weren't alone. And when we discovered there were others, it meant much of us to find a community. And so there must be many people out there that would be very glad to know that they're not alone. And so we felt that we needed to raise the flag and say, hey, if you're one of us, here we are. And this seemed an easy way to do it, because Stranger in a Strange Land, everybody had read this, so people who identified it would be looking for something. So we became public as the Church of All Worlds, figuring that anybody who had read the book would go, wow, that's like in the book, I want to be a part of that, which worked. And the date of that was Labor Day weekend of 1967. And so we opened it by having a garage sale at a local beatnik coffee house. And the purpose was to raise enough money so we could get a coffee machine so we could put out a newsletter. That was the reason, which we did successfully. And in those days, churches could get free advertising in the paper and radio. They just give it. You didn't have to pay for it. So we said, okay, well, here's our shot then. We will come out and be the Church of All Worlds, and we'll get the free promotion, advertising. Well, it was very successful, and everybody wanted to know, what is this Church of All Worlds? So the owner of the coffee house asked me if I would come that Thursday and give a talk about this. This is my first public talk on this thing. So I said, sure. And I went to the little beatnik coffee house. All the walls were painted black. There's a little stage in the corner with a stool and a little microphone, set up here. And you come and you wear black turtleneck sweaters and you read bad poetry. That was the scene. classic. And so I did, and I talked about this stuff and these ideas, and somebody asked a fatal question. He said, what kind of a church is this? Are you guys some kind of a Christian cult? Are you one of these Eastern cults? I mean, in those days, there were all these things, the Moonies and the Krishna people and the Dianetics and Scientology. All kinds of little things were popping out in those days. And they just wanted to know where we fit. A logical question. Well, I'd grown up immersed in Greek mythology and, and customs and things like that. So I just said what came naturally. I said, well, I guess you could say we're pagans. Because that seemed to be the only identification that made any sense. And that was historical, because I was the first person to declare myself as pagan, ever. As not just identifying with long ago pagans, well, yeah, the old pagans, they really had a cool thing, but saying, well, we are pagans, this is a pagan church. And where we went on to incorporate as the first legal pagan church incorporated, and then started reaching out to other groups that we'd hear about. It would come to my attention that there was a bunch of people at Carleton College who were doing a Druid group, and then there was some Greek group here, an Egyptian group in Burbank, and some witches over somewhere else. And so I'd hear about these, and I'd reach out to them, because by now we had a newsletter. So, and this began in, we got ourselves up. Our incorporation came through on March 4th of 1968. We rented a coffee house that had been a Christian coffee house, and they gave it up because it wasn't working for them, because they weren't getting any converts, which is a real idea. So we took it over. And on March 21st, in spring equinox of 1968, we put out the first issue of a little newsletter called Green Egg. And the story of why it was called Green Egg is another one I can go into a bit. I'm taking a lot of time, which is your first question. So I would send it to these other groups I would hear about, or I'd read an ad or a newspaper article or something like that. I'd find out about them. And I'd say, hey, you guys sound like pagans. We're pagans. Let's join up and we'll all be pagans together. La-di-da-di-da. And they said, yeah, sure, that's what we are. And so we started getting this pagan alliance with like the Federation. A strong model at that time, of course, was Star Trek, came out in 1966. And Lance and I both really identified with the Kirk and Spock characters. We had that relationship for our whole life. He was the Spock and me the Kirk.
Can I grab anything?
Oh, I think we're good. Right up to his death a few years ago. And the model of the United Federation of Planets was a good model for building a community of autonomous yet interconnected groups. And that was the model that we did as we developed a pagan community and used Green Egg, which grew from a one-page initial thing to a regular 70-page regular magazine. And we published everybody's manifestos and stuff about each other and letter columns and discussions and stuff, fostering the emergence of a global pagan community, which is now estimated at about 5 million people. And I started it 51 years ago.
It's really neat.
So that's the story.
Thank you. So, when you talk about being the founder of Ka, what exactly is your role? Do you consider yourself kind of a prophet of Gaia? I know Gaia doesn't really work like that, but are you a prophet? Is this some glorified position? Are you just the discerner of truth that you figured this out? How exactly do you fit in?
That's an interesting question. How would you define a prophet?
In the traditional term, someone who speaks on behalf of God or a God?
Okay, in that sense, I don't think I would try to claim being a prophet. I
Gaia
don't
isn't
think
really
I
that
don't think I
personal
speak
voice.
on behalf of the gods.
Okay.
Exactly. I do talk about them, especially about Gaia, because part of the religious aspect of Stranger in a Strange Land was the theology of immanent divinity. The idea that divinity is not something outside that messes with us, but it's our inner nature, that we are all internally divine. And the metaphor, again with the water thing, is water. If you ask somebody, well, let's describe water. What does it look like? Well, it's clear. Okay, well, not much to see there. What color is it? No, it doesn't have a color. Well, what shape is it? Oh, well, it's cylindrical. Well, not really. It's in a cylindrical container, but the water is not cylindrical. So what is personhood? What is soul? What is our essence as people? Is it the physical container, or is it within? And if it is within, the real what makes us human, what makes us us, is not just the bodies we wear, just like the glass, but what's inside it. Then it's not at all much of a stretch to say, well, that is part of the universality of spirit, of universal cosmic spirit, and we just happen to be a container that some of it's poured into. But at a deeper level, we're a part of this much greater thing. And we call that divinity, we call that God, we call that spirit, we call that consciousness, today we call it the quantum field, because that's exactly what we're talking about here. So, in that context, I guess
You said you just figured out the truth and are sharing it with other people?
Well, I figured out something that works. It's more of a revelation, I guess. I guess that's probably the best way to do it. But insight, revelation, understanding. I mean, I've had a lifetime of study in mythology, and I majored in psychology and sociology and anthropology in college, so I had a broad perspective. I took every course in comparative religions they had. I'd read all these science fiction books, and I hypothesized and speculated on different ways of thinking about stuff. And I just kind of all brought that to bear in a way of developing a cosmology, a perspective that incorporated all of this stuff, the wisdom of the ages, which all boils down to one very simple key phrase: all the wisdom of all the ages. And you can talk to any shaman, holy man, teacher, anywhere in the world, and they will affirm this. The essential core of the wisdom is, in the words of Cicero, omnia vivant, omnia inter se connexit. Everything is alive, everything is interconnected. That's the core. And when you have that perspective and you apply it to everything, which you sort of have to, it isn't like any single person becomes a prophet. It's like I'm a visionary, is what I really am more than anything else. Is I'm able to have a vision and articulate it, and if it makes sense to other people, I mean, lots of people have visions. Some of them are completely cloud cuckoo, and they're all off on their own with their own little private vision and stuff. And people, their friends, indulge them, and you say, well, he's got this notion, Other ones catch on and become widespread. That's where the great religions of the world come from. Somebody was a visionary, and they taught their idea and their wisdom, and people said, yeah, that makes sense, But that doesn't necessarily, some of them may consider themselves a prophet. They are speaking on behalf of a God that they have made the connection with, and so on. They become a mouthpiece or a channel for that communication. There's plenty of that. But there's others, like Buddhism, for example, that doesn't believe that there is a God type of a thing. They have insights and understandings of the nature of life and existence and how things all work. But you wouldn't really call Buddha a prophet exactly. You'd call him a visionary, a leader, a wizard, a wise one. And it's that kind of a thing that I think is closer to what my role is. Officially, when I started off, I was the founder. And then when we incorporated and were able to do ordinations, legal ordinations, I was the first to be ordained, and I became the high priest for 7 years, because we had that 7-year kind of a thing about this. And then I passed that mantle on to someone else to serve. And then I was given the role of primate, which means first one, which seemed logical in his reference made. But they also call the Pope the primate of the Catholic Church, and it also refers to the entire order of hominids, which I think is pretty cool. I'm right up there with the monkeys and apes and tarsiers and lemurs and all the rest of it, which is what we are, and that's cool. So that has kind of stuck with me. So I'm officially the primate. I'm currently, for the last few years, have been on the board of directors as president, but I haven't always been on the board or president. Other people have had that role over time. But everybody in the church for over 50 years has always recognized me as sort of the center of the whole thing somehow or other. But I don't. It's not like other organizations. I don't tell anybody what to do. I don't give orders. People don't follow me. They don't do what I say. And it just doesn't work that way. People hang out. We hang out together because we are on the same page, kind of a thing.
You told me a little bit about it, but can you tell me about your belief in theology? Do you believe in God, gods? You mentioned Gaia. What exactly is, it's a her, right? Gaia?
Well, yes.
What exactly is her role? And you mentioned some other gods.
Well, Gaia is the old Greek name for the Earth Mother, from which we derive all of our Earth terminology, geography, geology. The original Greek spelling was basically G-E, gay. The Romans added the additional ending to it to put it into the Roman language, so we get Gaia, which is G-A-E-A, and it's misspelled by almost everybody today as G-A-I-A, but that was a transliteration from hearing the pronunciation of it as Gaia and writing it down that way. But that's not the actual correct spelling, so it's interesting. So Gaia is Mother Earth. In the Greek mythology of the theogony, the birth of the gods, Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the heavens, come into being at the same time. They're born out of night and chaos, and things like that. So these are primal sort of things. And Eros, the god of love, which basically means the force of cosmic attraction. You could say gravity. You could say anti-entropy, the force that brings things together in the universe. Eros. But we also imagine him as the Cupid figure with the little wings shooting arrows. In the story, Eros hovered above the earth and showered arrows down upon earth, and these fertilized Gaia herself and brought forth all life. Well, visualize the early earth with comets raining down upon it from space, carrying spores and stuff from the universe. And that appears to be the origin of life on earth, is from comets. All the water on earth comes from comets. It doesn't come from inside the earth, it comes from space. Still coming, it's still happening all the time. Although not as much as in the early days, because we used up a bit of it, but it's still coming. So that's the mythology of Gaia, the mother of all life, the Mother Earth. Everybody knows about that. Mother Nature, everybody knows who she is. The vision of Gaia that I got takes it another step further. In 1970 was a remarkable year for me. I had my first acid experience on the occasion of an eclipse of the sun in that spring of that year. I figured, okay, this is a good occasion. Maybe I should try out this acid stuff. I've never done that before. Everybody else had, and I always had some around, but I was waiting for the perfect occasion. The eclipse of the sun seemed to do it. And that was in spring. Then that April was the first Earth Day, which is a big deal, and brought a whole lot of focus on that. And that summer, I read a couple of books called The White Goddess by Robert Graves and The Great Cosmic Mother by Eric Newman. And both of these talked about the historical culture around the Great Mother, that this was kind of the first religion in many ways. The little Stone Age images of little fat, pregnant, little female figures that are faceless, that come down from 30,000 years ago and on up for about 25,000 years. All of the sculptured representations of human figures were female, and they all were so similar they looked like they could have been made by the same artist. So we're talking about a culture, a cult object, a source of reverence. It spanned 25,000 years of time in human history. At the very beginning, it was the first and oldest. The concept of the mother of all mothers, from whom we were all descended. We were all the children of the Great Mother, through our lineage of our mother and our mother's mother and our mother's mother. Well, I read all this stuff, and I had always been interested in evolution. I mean, I was one of those dinosaur kids, I knew all the dinosaurs, fascinated by evolution, history, geology, cosmology, all these things. So all this kind of percolated together in a fair amount of acid that summer. And on Labor Day weekend of that year, I did acid with my girlfriend at that time, and in the most amazing experience. I remember every detail of it. That summer, a local witch had opened up a store, one of the first hippie witches to open a little store. Her name was Deborah Letter. She just died a few years ago, but I visited her store, which still continues on my journey. So it's a long history there. And so she taught classes, I enrolled in the classes. And one of the first things that she taught was how to see auras, how to be able to look at some living thing and see the kind of a glow around it that a living beings produce. It's a little trick of vision that anybody can learn. It's just a little exercise. So I was kind of tripping out on that. That was pretty cool. So here we are laying on a trampoline, laying naked on a trampoline in the backyard of a friend's house on Labor Day weekend, looking up at the stars on a clear, starry night. And Julie had grown up in the city, and she didn't know the stars, because you don't see them. But I'd grown up in the country, and the constellations and the stars were a fascination, so I knew them all. So I was trying to point them out to her, and I realized that I could point my fingers out and draw the line to connect the dots, and the line would stay there. It's what we call trails, that you actually can kind of leave a little trail that you can see with your eye where your finger is pressed with the aura, essentially. And so I'm sitting there drawing the lines to connect the dots for the constellations. I've never been able to do it like that before, which is pretty cool. And she's looking up at that, and we're talking. And I was getting tripped about, as I moved my fingers apart to do things, they would separate, and they glow around them. They would get to a point where then it would part. And it looked like cells dividing. It's how a cell divides. It's all like this, and it starts pulling apart, and eventually there's a little tenuous link between them, and then that goes away, and then you got two separate cells. I was doing that with my fingers, and I was making the Star Trek live long and prosper sign, and playing around with this, and I had this vision, and it opened up with a cell division. And I think, all my cells in my body divided like that, but they started off with, going back to the first original cell, the first fertilized cell which I began. And that goes back to my parents, my mother, and down through the lineage and mother lineage. And I fell into the river of DNA of my entire history, just following, tracing it on back, because we're all the same continuity of DNA and the same protoplasm, because each time the cells divide, the protoplasm is divided into both along with the DNA. So there's a continuity of that. The protoplasm in every cell of our body goes back billions of years. It's a continuum. And so I kind of went back into the river of my DNA and protoplasm, back to the dawn of time, the first cell that began the process. And I saw that as equivalent to the zygote that begins the human embryology. And I saw that the entire evolution of life on Earth is the embryology of a vast organism. And so I went all the way back to there, and then in my mind, and I'm lying my back looking up at the stars, and you might as well be out in space when you're doing that. If you don't see around you, you could be way out there. And I'm totally, wow, we're out here in space, and then they're kind of rewinding the thing, and I watched this life go from the first original cell spreading out across the globe and differentiating into countless species and organisms, just like it happens in our own body, like watching an embryo developing through fast motion photography. And I had that exact same equivalence, and matched it over that. And I'm seeing the entire biosphere of Earth is literally, not figuratively or hypothetically or imaginatively, literally one single vast biological living organism, a creature, a vast creature. And we're in whose body we're just cells, just like the cells in ours.
Sorry to interrupt, just making sure everything's going
well. Oh, it's all good, thank you. And at that point, I was visioning myself up in space, looking down upon the Earth. And she opened her eyes and she smiled at me and she said, "Now you know me." And I just wept. These tears just squirted from my face. And I, if I hadn't been lying flat on my back, I would have fallen to my knees, because that was the feeling I had. And I said, the only thing I could possibly respond to that was, I will ever serve you. And that was the beginning of my dedication to Gaia, Mother Earth. So then, once I had that understanding of the entire planet as a single vast living creature, it wasn't much of a stretch to consider not only are all people part of this, we're all cells in this greater body, but there's organs too. Biosystems, species form essentially organs. In each of them, we have our own, as only an individual cell, we have our own consciousness. We're a conscious being. We think of ourselves, we have an identity, a name. We think of ourselves as conscious. Well, by that same token, so would everything else. There would be a consciousness there. And then some of them transcend this, so you get a consciousness that's of a community, a tribal consciousness. A tribal god appears. Totems appear out of this concept. Collective species things like the cat goddess, Bast, or the god of thunder, Thor. All these things emerge out of that concept of like organs in a greater system. And these are the consciousnesses of these organs. But the organs are real. It's like having the consciousness of your liver or your heart or your stomach or whatever. They do. They have their own little nerve systems and clusters. And they do their thing, and we don't have to pay attention. They're okay. They're on their own. And it's like that with the whole thing. So going from the Gaia thesis of seeing the entire planetary organism, and so everything within that, it's not only has a physical visibility, but also there is a consciousness, soul visibility. That was the theology of the gods. That's who the gods are. The gods are soul essences of different collective entities that don't necessarily have a single body, but are collective, that are shared bodies, or transcendent, and so on. But all part of a system, all integrated. Well, it's not much of a stretch to go up the other way, too. See, the entire Earth is a cell in the greater body of, say, the solar system. And you expand beyond that and see the solar system as a cell in the body of the galaxy. And expand beyond that and see the galaxy as a cell in the vaster network of the universe. And so on it goes. And so that's the essential theology that emerged from this kind of thinking. Okay.
What do you believe about the afterlife?
Oh, yes. Well, that's a good one. Belief is a strange word. Belief often means considering a thing to be true despite having no evidence of that. I remember reading a book of conversations with Victorian children, and it was a whole collection of them about their opinions on things. And the one that struck me was some little girl, and the question that the kids were being asked is, what is faith? This kind of book on religious stuff. And someone will go, faith is believing something that you know isn't true. So I kind of avoid, terms like belief and stuff like that. I go with opinions. I go with knowledge, experience, lots of things like that. But I'm really not big on believing things because I found from talking to true believers that belief often trumps facts and knowledge. And if people believe something, it doesn't really matter whether it's true or backed up or disproven or anything else. They're going to believe that because they believe it. You get people like that about the Bible, I was really struck when my father told me that he didn't believe in evolution. And to me, that was like saying, no, I don't believe in gravity. It's not a matter of belief. This is what happens. Okay, you don't have to believe in it or not. It's still going to happen. It's not up to you to decide whether it happens because you believe in it or not. But this is the opinion people have, their opinion or their belief. Given that caveat, I came into this incarnation with direct transition from my maternal grandfather into this life. And I remember that transition. I remember the death and the awakening in this new body without even realizing the new body, because he died of a heart attack. My mother got pregnant almost immediately thereafter, and they turned his... my father had to go off in the war, so my mother stayed at her family's home, where her father had just died, and they made his room into the nursery. And I awoke in the same bed I died in, looking around in the same room with the same family that I had before, and it took me a long time to realize that something was very different, that it wasn't in the same body anymore. I was in a new body, and I had to get used to that and adjust to that. I have done a lot of study on this subject. Childhood nightmares, little kids who have nightmares, there's been a lot of studies on this, and they almost invariably break down to their memory of their previous death. And then that's what causes the nightmares, because they don't have any other experience. They don't have anything else to go on. Where's a baby who's going to be getting nightmares from? So I think this happens a lot. The interval between the death and the rebirth seems to be variable. In my case, it was almost immediate. But in many cases that are reported, there may be decades or centuries that may go by in between these. The question is, where do they go in the meantime? But they clearly have those memories. When I was growing up, they were always telling me, they'd say, that's just what your grandfather used to say. Oh, you're just like your grandfather. Or your grandfather was into that too, something. And I had memories of my childhood that was like a box of snapshots that had been taken, and then somebody just shook them all up and threw them up in the air, and then they sprawl all over the floor, and I could not sequence them. I was trying to put these memories, which are snapshots of my childhood, which is odd. I don't have a continuous memory of my childhood. I have a bunch of snapshots. And I was trying to put them into order. So I was actually going into some therapy to try to help me with this. A little hypnotic regression would try to sort out. And I kept running into places where I couldn't fit some of these pictures. So I called my mother, had a long conversation with her about, well, when did this happen? What year was that? How old was I then when this happened? And she would say, that didn't happen to you. That happened to your grandfather. But I remember it entirely clearly. I'm certain it happened to me. I remember all the details very clearly. No, that was your grandfather. Eventually, I told my father about this. He was a very devout Christian. And he said, well, I've come to believe in reincarnation, and you're the perfect example. Because you get somebody like, Mozart or Beethoven or something, and as a child, they come into this world being able to compose symphonies. They didn't have time to learn that in this lifetime. They came in with it from somewhere else before that. So he was absolutely convinced in reincarnation because of that, which I hadn't really thought about. It hadn't been the conversation. Growing up in my family's thing, there was no discussion about reincarnation. It just wasn't there. If I'd grown up in a Hindu family, it would have been a whole different thing. But so I would have to say now that I take it beyond an opinion or a belief, but I'm okay with those words. But I have an understanding that just because the water in the cup gets poured out, it doesn't go away. It's still there. And if it gets poured out, it ends up eventually going into the ocean. And then some other time, somebody can come in and dip out another cup out of the ocean. And that cup will contain bits and memories of every consciousness that has ever been. And maybe concentrated. And maybe you'll get a particularly coherent batch of them if it's, will be there in a complete, more or less complete personality will be in this cup. Because there it is. And I think that applies to all living beings, because spirit, as the fifth element, is the animating force of all life. It isn't just people. It's what makes the difference between this plate and, and the squid, which is once alive, That's the difference. It's the spirit, the soul. So I strongly believe in that kind of stuff. And my current studies in quantum physics back that up entirely. And the leading thinkers in the edge of quantum physics are saying exactly the same thing. So I feel I'm on the right path with this. But we're still exploring, we're still learning stuff, and there's things that it's hard to know what's on the other side. But the prevailing theory right now in quantum physics is what they call the simulation hypothesis. And that is that this world in reality is on the order of a simulation, like Second Life or World of Warcraft. It's very well done, very realistic. We're constantly creating it ourselves and participating, but we're all inhabiting and animating avatars. This is not the real thing. The real thing is this ineffable, the water inside the cup, and that is immortal and eternal. We don't really die. We come into an incarnation. We incarnate, we discorporate, we disincarnate, maybe come back again. Maybe continue on, come back. Maybe we decide to play another round of the game because it was a good game. We really liked it. Or maybe decide, well, let's go off and try a different game. Lots of possibilities there. But that's kind of my general working hypothesis of how things work.
So there's no real rhyme or reason as to who or what you'll come back as, but you specifically, and possibly more unique than most, came back as your grandfather, from your grandfather rather? Okay.
I think it was probably more proximity than anything else. Many people I talk to about reincarnation who hold beliefs based on the philosophy and stuff hold that people choose their incarnations. And people will say, oh, well, you choose who you're going to be born to and how you're going to incarnate, what your life is going to be and all this stuff. I don't see any reason to accept that as truth. That's an opinion that people have, and it's taught by many religions to teach about reincarnation. But I have not seen any indication or evidence of that in the studies or my own experience. I think it's more like hitchhiking, You stand by the side of the road and you wait for a car to come by. And if the car comes by and it looks like a good one, you get in. And there you are off on the next part of the journey. And that's as much as I think of it. I don't think you plan it any more than that, really. But, what do I know? Some people might do that. Maybe they've got some kind of a university over there where they study this stuff and they figure out, I didn't get there. I just came directly from this one to that.
Interesting. What's the difference between paganism, neo-paganism, and Wicca? And what's your relationship specifically to other pagan beliefs?
What's the relationship to what to other pagan groups? You mean the Church of All Worlds?
The Church of All Worlds. I know you mentioned that a little bit about how you kind of, I'm pagan, you're pagan, let's do this together. So you've kind of answered that. But
well, pagan literally means people of the land, of the country. It's the root word that our modern English is peasant. That's where it comes from. And so it refers to the customs and the folklore and the folk beings of the people of the country, as opposed to the people of the cities. It was the Roman term that they used. And the Roman civic city religion was very organized in temples and hierarchy and priesthoods and all that stuff. But the people out in the country just did their country stuff. And they were the pagans. But there's that meaning of pagan as kind of indigenous folk religion, which applies to everybody, whether it's Native American or African or ancient European or whatever. All were pagans until some new empiric religion came in and took over, usually by force of arms. So we talk about the conquest of Canaan by the early Jews, the Hebrews. The Canaanite people were pagan. It says so, and that's what they're called in the Bible. And then this organized religion with this monotheistic thing came in and took them over. And then, of course, the Christian takeover of the world is pretty well known. But before the Christians were there, the people were pagans, the old religion. Same thing for Buddhism, Islam. Islam is still actively engaged in this, and so is the Catholic Church and stuff. You go into places where the people are pagan, and they convert them to their religion, generally forcibly, sometimes not so much, but mostly. So paganism is the old religion, the old ways. But there's universality in that. It is very different, because the prophetic revealed religions that are founded by some founding prophet, who develops followers and armies and goes forth to conquer the world and spread their dominion, have a set agenda and scriptures and organized rules and stuff like that, which they want to impose on everybody, whether you like them or not. But paganism doesn't exist in that. There's no founding prophet, or there's teachers and wise ones, mostly poets and stuff, who are highly regarded because their stuff is meaningful. But they're not worshipped or followed, they don't make rules. You try to make rules for pagan gods, they go, what are you talking about, In the Church of All Worlds, we only have one rule, and it's be excellent to each other. That's our whole 10 Commandments, Church of All Worlds. That's all we need. What else? In witchcraft, the rule is, and harm none, do as you will. So it's harm none is their rule. Witchcraft is a subset of paganism. Witches were the shamans. So every pagan village throughout the world, every pagan culture, will have set roles within it. If it's a very organized village, they might have a village blacksmith, they might have a village potter, they will have a village midwife, maybe, or herbalist. Well, that would be the witch. And the witch was a craft, a role in the village, like the blacksmith had a role in the craft. So, and generally, she tended to be a widow who lived at the edge of the village with her herb garden and foraged in the forest at the time of year to get the herbs to practice her healing arts. She was basically the village healer, and generally a midwife, and women would generally go to her for advice and counsel, and she could mix up herbs and brews and potions, some of them with magical intentions, some of them with purely medical intentions, and a great deal of overlap between the two. And that was the witch. And she became into persecution by the church, specifically over competition over the medical thing. When the doctors started coming in as male doctors, they wanted to dominate the field, and people weren't going to them because they didn't trust them, because they actually didn't know what they were doing. They would continued going to the village healer who knew about the herbs and the healing potions, which in fact turned out to be incredibly valid. Now most of our medicinal stuff is now coming from herbs. So that was kind of the way the witch fitted into the picture. In the pagan movement that has emerged, and we use the term neo-pagan when we need to make a distinction between the old pagan stuff of ancient times, like the ancient Druids or Greeks or Vikings or any of them. See, there's two major categories of the old pagan. There's the village country people, and there's the classical things that we also identify, because that's where we get the mythology. So we refer to classical paganism, the pagan glory of ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt and all that, as pagan, although they would not have accepted that terminology themselves because they looked at it differently. It would have been more acceptable to talk about it that way in Greece and Egypt. You could say everybody's pagan. People would have gone along with that. Because we talked about the pagan philosophers, which were the wizards of ancient Greece, of course, Plato and Socrates and all these guys. So the label pagan is applied to them. So that's cool. It's a good one. Because they were the teachers, philosophy. So you have roles within paganism. You have the wizards, the wise men, who are respected for their knowledge and their wisdom. And the word wizard means wisdom. Wizardry means wisdom. A wizard is a wise one, literally. That's what the word means. And in ancient Greece, the word we use philosophy. Philosopher means lover of wisdom. Philosophy is lover of wisdom. So that wisdom idea comes in, and the wisdom teaching that I said, that everything is alive, everything is interconnected, is core to that. So that's kind of what the vision is. So to use the term neo refers to modern groups that are formed, often inspired by or trying to include the wisdom or teachings or ritual or something, or the mythology of some ancient traditions. Many of these are culturally based, kind of national things. So we have, modern Greek, Egyptian, or Baltic type of groups. We have some that have simply continued the old way forever, like Lithuania, Latvia, Scandinavia. There's no break there. The old religion just continues, and the people today continue practicing just like their ancestors had for generations. And the sacred sites are still there, they go to that, and the mythology is continuous. But other groups have had to recreate themselves. Many of them have tried to do this with inspiration from ancient times, like the modern Druids. But we don't have the continuity of Druidic lore because the Druids were pretty much wiped out by the Romans, and they didn't leave behind any writings. All we get really are some poetry that comes down, which is recorded by the church fathers, and so it's always a little bit sketchy what we can accept or not. Although it's pretty inspiring stuff, much of it. So today, we just generally use the term pagan to include everybody because it seems to work. We've even had large, older indigenous groups like Hinduism, for example. Hinduism declared themselves at alliance with the Western pagans because we're all pagans together, which I think is really cool because, they're pagans. The Taoists are pagans, but not the Buddhists or the Muslims or the Jews or the Christians because they're derived from a prophetic vision of somebody who's spreading this thing. But the old religion doesn't have that. The thing that unites it worldwide is what's called the wheel of the year, the cycle of seasonal celebrations. The pagan celebrations and festivals are not based on the birthdays or death dates or great battles or anniversaries or anything at all. They're based on the turning of the year. So we're just right now at winter solstice, the longest night, shortest day of the year. So throughout the world, everybody celebrates this time. The Christians celebrate it as Christmas, Jews celebrate it as Hanukkah, it goes on and on and on. Because it's a time in the year that we all experience. Everybody in the temperate latitudes, the north, has this seasonal thing. And so the seasonal cycle of the solstices and the equinoxes, these aren't determined by some particular religion or not. They're determined because the earth is moving around the sun and taking these different positions. And the cross quarters, so there's 4. Solstices, winter solstice, summer solstice, spring equinox, fall equinox. Halfway in between them, making a total cycle of 8 every 6 weeks, are the cross-quarter festivals. And these are, Samhain, which we just had in Salem, which is Halloween in popular parlance. Bridget, or Imbolc, which means in the belly or in milk, which is the 1st of February. It comes down to us as Groundhog's Day and Candlemas in the Catholic Church. We have spring equinox, of course, which is still called by the ancient name, Easter. It's the name of the goddess of the eastern star, Astara, from which we get the concept of estrus cycle, and Ishtar, goddess of fertility. He didn't even change the name of that one. It's still Easter, and it's all about the return of life and the resurrection of life from the earth, and bunnies and Easter eggs, and it's all pagan stuff. It's completely. Same thing for winter solstice. All the celebrations and customs around Christmas are all. Then we get Beltane, May Day. And we all know about May Day, maypoles, and the May Queen, and Queen of the May, and all that kind of stuff. Everybody knows this stuff. Then you got summer solstice.
Sorry to interrupt. Just making sure you guys are all set.
You're doing good, aren't you? Summer solstice, Midsummer Night's Eve, Shakespeare, all that stuff. And that's the longest day and the shortest night. Then we move into Lughnasadh, the 1st of August, the first of the Harvest Festival. The festival of Lu, the sun god, because it's this moment of the year. Summer solstice may be the shortest night, but it's also considered the first day of summer, not the middle of summer, even though we call it midsummer. But the actual middle of the summer season is the 1st of August, 6 weeks later. And the old name for that is Lughnasadh. In the Catholic Church, they call it Lammas, which means loaf mass, which means the day when you first bake bread. This is the festival of the harvest of the grain. And so it's your first harvest of the 3 harvest festivals. The next one is fall equinox, which we call Mabon, which refers to the son of the goddess. And it's the harvest of, it's fall equinox, the harvest of the fall fruits. Fruits and vegetables, all come in at that time. And it's Thanksgiving. It's the old tradition of Thanksgiving, a harvest home, and there's songs and customs around it, and all that stuff. And all of these things are associated with lots and lots of customs, which are still carried on and have been for thousands of years. Despite the dominion of whatever other faith may be controlling, the people still do these things. And then, of course, the next one is Samhain, the 3rd harvest and last of the harvest festivals, and that's Halloween, the Day of the Dead. This time we celebrate the ancestors, the beloved dead. It's the time when the year turns into the underworld, the dark half of the year. And so Samhain and Beltane, at opposite ends of the year, the 1st of May and the 1st of November, are considered the hinges of the year, between the summer year and the winter year, is how we're saying. So in both of them, at that hinge, the veil between the worlds is considered to be the thinnest. And so you stay up all night and you commune with the spirits and remember those who have gone before and honor the beloved dead and get real introspective about all that stuff. And then we come around to Yule, winter solstice, which is the return of the light, because it's been getting darker and darker and darker, but from this moment forward, it's going to get brighter and brighter and brighter, So all of the festivals are about the birth of the sun. And most of them spell it S-U-N, but some of them spell it S-O-N. And the birthdays of all the solar deities, from Jesus to Krishna to Buddha to Apollo, are all on winter solstice. because it's the birth of the sun, the return of the light. And this is a cycle that unifies pagans all over the world. In the southern hemisphere, the same cycle exists, but it's reversed. So winter solstice here is summer solstice in Australia, for instance. But otherwise, it's the same cycle. And this universality is what ties together pagans, old and new, neo-pagans, ancient pagans, worldwide customs, folklore, songs, everything is all tied together in the wheel of the year, the great unifier.
So, the Church of All Worlds and the Wicca, while being characteristically different, there's no real barrier or divide between them.
No, it's like within Christianity, we have the Catholics and the Mormons and the Baptists and the Unitarians. They're all Christians, you know. Well, and the same thing in paganism. Paganism is the umbrella term that includes and embraces all these different groups. But we're all real friendly with each other. We all hang out together. We go to each other's events and stuff. We have big festivals that everybody comes to. I just in the last few days, I've done winter solstice celebrations in 2 different Wiccan covens, and one big general pagan group that was had about 100 people. You know, that was much larger kind of a community and in a different focus and stuff. And they're all wonderful, and I felt right at home and completely welcomed and moving from one community to another. I'm going to go another couple tomorrow, and day after, I'm going up and spending Christmas with some friends because that's their family is doing, and they want me to come up for that. And it's all cool. Mm-hmm.
How do you relate, and the Church of All Worlds relate to followers of other religions? I know you mentioned Hinduism, but like Christianity, Islam, Buddhism.
Well, we're fine with all of them. Some of them are not fine with us. The monotheistic traditions don't tend to play well with others, and it's sort of a problem. But at the first week of November, I was up in Toronto for the Parliament of the World's Religions with 10,000 people from different religious groups all around the world. And there were Hindus and Sikhs and Buddhists and pagans and Native Americans and you know, the Muslims were not there because they don't play well with others. But pretty much everybody, and we had a wonderful time. Everybody's in their full ritual regalia, and we're hanging out together, and we're dancing and going to each other's things and singing songs and hearing talks and sitting and having conversations around breakfast bars, and we all get along fine. It's like a cosmopolitan city where you've got dozens of different restaurants and different cultures are done, you know, and everybody enjoys eating at different restaurants. You have a big potluck feast and everybody brings something different. That's the model that we hold as pagans, because paganism is polytheistic. You know, it means that we accept many gods, all of them. We don't say anybody else's gods are false or whatever. That's preposterous. In our fundamental theology, all these are real. These are all personas of consciousness that people relate to and commune with. Why would somebody deny the existence of somebody else's? It would be like saying your grandmother didn't really exist, you know. Because where is she now? You know, I don't see her, you know. Well, I'm sorry, but, you know, yeah, she did exist. I talk to her all the time, you know, that kind of stuff. So the paganism vision is extremely inclusive. And I think that's what's giving it strength, why it's grown in these 50 years from a tiny handful of people to a worldwide movement, because it works. You know, it's a place that everybody can get together with each other. It's a game everybody can play. It's a sandbox big enough for everyone. And it accepts everybody else's stuff. We're not denying anybody else's traditions, you know. You know, we had in one of our group marriages of 5 people, one of our wives was Jewish, for example. So we had a menorah on our Yule altar, you know, and we had a Christmas tree in the corner because, you know, we had Christian. Morning Glory's mother was a devout Christian, so we did that. And we had our pagan Yule stuff there. And we had, you know, celebrated Hanukkah and sang songs of all these different things. And had a wonderful time. Everybody got along. The Church of All Worlds membership application specifically says that membership in this church does not involve having to exclude membership in any other thing. So we can have Christian members of the church, we can have Jewish members of the church.
And do, don't you?
And do, absolutely do. It was in the original book idea. I mean, the original Church of All
One of the
Worlds.
first Water Brothers in Strange Land was a Muslim.
Exactly. So you remember the story.
Yes.
Okay, so I shouldn't have had to tell you the whole
No,
story.
for the record, I'm glad you did. But
Stinky Mahmood. Right?
Yeah.
Right. So you remember that, yes. And we're like that. We have that. The same thing as in our school. The Gray School of Wizardry is it's not a religious school, but we have members of every religion because that isn't a factor. You're welcome here. You want to be here, you're welcome here. That's inclusive. Right now, there's a big argument going on in the larger community, especially the pagan community, around transsexuals. And as far as we're concerned, you're welcome. Who cares, whatever you want to be,
I'm surprised that's a hot button issue.
Well, it isn't with some groups, but it is with others, because there are some groups that are founded on being exclusive in one way or another. There's all women's groups, there's all men's groups, there's some groups that are based on ethnicity or something, that they practice, the practice of ancient, Iceland or something like that, most of the witchcraft covens are initiatory, so you really have to be initiated with that particular tradition to be welcomed. Everybody welcomes me, but I've been initiated into so many different things that nobody even remembers, and I know all their stuff, so I can fit right in and do the stuff and respond appropriately to the things. But the pagan movement is a federation, like the United Federation of Planets, and fundamental to it is the concept of the Prime Directive. You don't interfere in anybody else's trip. They do what they do, and if you don't like it, you can't have any, and it's okay. Form your own group if you want to, and that's okay too. Or join some group that you're welcome in. But there are people, a segment of the trans community that really consider themselves to be women, that they're physiologically male, and they resent being excluded from some of the all-women circles that have been designed specifically to deal with female issues that are female issues. I mean, like menstruation, and shame and abortion and pregnancy and rape and things like that, that no matter how a trans person may have tried to go through the changes or identify themselves, or their very soul may very well have incarnated from a previous incarnation as female, because most theories of incarnation say that you're not necessarily come back in the same gender, or the same sex. And I think the crucial is to distinguish between sex and gender, because pretty much everybody recognizes that, and that's where I'm trying to move the argument to, is that we can accept that there is sex, which is male and female, physiology, genetics, all that stuff. But gender is your identity, and you may very well be in a male body, but your identity is female. Your last incarnation, you were a girl, you want to be that again, here you are. So you can be a male woman or a female woman, depending on which it goes. And if people can get used to that idea with everybody, it should make it okay for everybody. But in the Church of All Worlds, and in most of the pagan movements, this really isn't an issue, because we just simply welcome everybody. And if we said, at Beltane, for example, we have a thing where the women go up and decorate the maypole place where we're going to set it up, and they decorate the Yoni Gate, that is admission into the meadow, and the men are down with the pole, getting it all set up, in a different area, and we're talking about men stuff, like, how do we become men, what does that mean to be a man, and the women are talking about that stuff, and we just say, go to wherever you feel you belong. And so the transsexuals will go with whatever and that's fine, they're all cool. What does that mean to you? We'll come around to them and say, well, what does it mean to you to be a woman if you grew up as a man? Well, this is what this means. Cool, thank you. We move along. So we just don't have these issues, But we accept that other groups do, and that's okay, because it's a federation, Nobody has to tell anybody what to do. Nobody is required to do what somebody else does. Like polyamory, for example, is very big in the pagan community, probably more than any other religious community, as an accepted thing. But it's not like a requirement or anything. Probably the vast majority of our people are probably monogamous, I guess. Nobody asks. Nobody cares. We got lots of gays. I have no idea how many or what percentage. Nobody thinks about it.
Not important to you guys.
Not important to it, We have transsexuals. We have... It just isn't really what it's all about. We get along. We hang out with each other.
You mentioned some about Stranger in a Strange Land, and kind of gave the run through about that. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add, but again, it sounds a little redundant based on what you've already said, but what role did Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land play in the creation of Ka? How similar is Ka to the Church of All Worlds mentioned in this book? And I put down, obviously the name, the rings, the inner rings as you graduate to more intimacy.
Right. Moving inward from there.
Rocking, thou art God, sharing water, just in general, how similar is the Church of All Worlds to what's mentioned in the book?
Well, structurally, as much as possible, philosophically, to a great extent. Obviously, we've been evolving these thinking for 50 years. We had extensive correspondence with Mr. Heinlein when he was still alive, and he was very helpful.
I was wondering about that. I was wondering how on board he was with you taking the name and a lot of details.
That was great. He said, in the early days after the book came out, he said he was actually approached by a number of groups that formed their own little nests and water brotherhoods. We just happened to be the one to actually get it organized and incorporated and continue as a legal church. And some of those other groups came in with this one because it's structured. Well, I need to get some more sauce. But yeah, he was fine with it. He subscribed to our magazine even. I would have given him a free subscription, but he was all about paying for everything. There's no such thing as a free lunch kind of philosophy, so he insisted on paying for a subscription to Green Egg. But sometimes he'd comment on things in there. We had a friendly relationship. We only met physically one time. He was on a... But I got some more of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was on a book signing tour, raising for supporting a blood drive, and we ran into him on that. And so he came up to me, he's at the table, and said, who we were, Mondo and I, and he looked up and he beamed. He said, blessed be, and we had a little bit, but there was a line of people where he said, but it was, he signed a book, things like that. But I have extensive correspondence, which I think is important to the legacy of his work, because he didn't correspond with many people. So that's very important. So how are we different, obviously? Well, we don't have ancient Martians teaching us stuff. We don't have that particular element, which is a big part of the story, and the Martian language and all the rest of it. But there are elements. One of the things that appealed to us, thank you,
You're very welcome,
was Heinlein's own fascination with developing psychic abilities, expanding human potential to the maximum. He wrote several books and short stories that address this. And that was one of the things that always fascinated by me with his work, And so we continued doing that stuff. We, long before we got into the kind of magic that's now taught, we were experimenting with hypnosis and exercises of various sorts that were recommended by him and Ben Franklin and other people throughout history.
In your book, The Wizard and the Witch, did you say as a child that you had some telepathic abilities?
Mm-hmm. Very much. I think from what I know, a lot of kids do, and those who happen to grow up in sympathetic families are wonderful because they get to continue doing that, and they continue to go on to become successful in magical practices.
So some of that was naturally a gift, as
Right.
opposed to some of it later, which you purposely
Right.
tried to work on,
Right.
develop.
Yep, that was how it worked there. And I think, again, by the basic theological premise I'm operating, that we're all part of a larger system, all interconnected, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that there could be these quantum entanglement connections that enable us to commune in different ways with
We're
each
both
other.
connected to the same power source, so
Exactly.
there would be some transference.
Exactly. And pretty much this is what is taught by all the religions and faiths that have a mystical, occult, metaphysical side to them. They all talk about tapping the source and channeling the power and stuff like that. So it's not really that bizarre. Paganism itself isn't really, when you talk to people, everybody knows the same stories, the myths and legends that are the foundation of paganism. They all have experienced the same holiday customs that we're all familiar with. They just don't think that this is part of something else, something larger that includes them. They think of this is their little thing. But when you say, oh yeah, we all do that, oh really? Wow, yeah, this is a universal thing. Oh, okay. It all goes very easily. So it's not really weird, It's just that people have grown up with terms like witchcraft and paganism being used as pejoratives by the establishment churches, But there was a reason. They were trying to get rid of the competition, and we're just not competitive at all. We just welcome everybody and we just go on ahead.
What other sources helped inspire the Church of All Worlds? Specifically, you mentioned a couple science fiction books, but can you elaborate on that more? And then anything that's not science fiction?
Sure. Well, the science fiction books that I think we found most inspirational were the ones that addressed alien beings and cultures, in which ways they might be different and provide a different perspective, have different abilities. The old, Superman story, strange visitors from another planet with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men, So that was always fascinating. What possible powers and abilities might we encounter? The whole Star Trek idea, go out there and meet, strange civilizations, go boldly go where no one has gone before, and all that stuff. That kind of stuff is always really cool. What are the possibilities? It's like exploration. It's like people used to be fascinated by the stories of explorers in Africa or something like that. So there's that part. There's the ones that dealt with the future evolution of humanity was a popular thing. That was talked about. Arthur C. Clarke wrote about that in some of his books. Philip Jose Farmer. Olaf Stapleton's Odd John was a classic. The X-Men comics, the mutants with abilities, that kind of stuff really, that was intriguing and fascinating because it's all about what are the possibilities. And we were the kind of people that are always interested in what other possibilities might there be that we don't know yet. What else is out there? Who else is out there? So the things that address those bigger questions. Who are we? Where are we going? Is there anybody else? And this is the province of science fiction. This is not what you get in other fiction and stuff. And some of them dealt with historical stuff too. You go back, supposing something that happened just a little differently. How would the world have developed if the wind had blown on a summer day of 50 BCE and the Roman fleet had not beaten the Celtic fleet and the whole Roman Empire would have not ever come to be, what would the world be like today? Those kind of questions are really interesting. Paul Anderson, Dancer from Atlantis, about the destruction of Thera was a really good one about that. Supposing that hadn't happened, suppose that volcano hadn't blown up, what would the world be like afterwards? So, science fiction is the province where you can talk about that stuff.
Can you tell me a little bit about the nest in California? What does daily life look like there?
Well, we had a number of nests in California. They tended to revolve around families. So you'd have a family that would gather their members and immediate friends, and that would be a local nest. Morningo and I were together for 40 years before she died. We had 40 amazing years together. We would have really liked another 40, but that didn't work out that way. But during that time, half of our time together, we were in group marriages. So each of them, two of them, less than 10 years each. And it's not like they exactly ended, they just sort of morphed, and people moved and things like that. But what was I going to say about that? The nest. So our own family nest tended to revolve around the work that we did together as a family, which was publishing a magazine, creating our family business, mythic images, doing our art, doing workshops and presentations, a lot of stuff on polyamory that we did, throwing really amazing parties. We had great parties. Our annual Addams Family Reunion Party was legendary. Our summer hippy-dippy pool party was pretty cool. And other friends did the same thing, so we had this kind of network of the people in our immediate community that periodically throw these great parties and we'd all get together. There was a lot of interpenetration of lovers. Not everybody was poly, but enough were to form a kind of a network of connections throughout the whole place. which were wonderful and persisted for forever, really. I mean, they didn't go away. You know, I'm still on the road now, traveling and meeting lovers that I haven't seen in decades, but we still have that, you know, that wonderful feeling. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to be seeing Donna, and we met, what was it, 1982, I guess it was. And we've been hanging out together off and on for decades, you know, and we see each other periodically. So those kind of things go really deep, and they're really bonded. When we had enough place for it, big enough place for it, we all lived together in community in our family. At one point, we had a fairly nice little compound with dwelling units for 8 people. So we had our family business. We had Morning Glory's old aged Christian mother lived with us, you know, our kids, you know, our whole little thing. And we did our work together. We held sacred connections, kind of encounter groups that people would come to, and we would do all this nifty, you know, sensual massage and things like that. It was having a group of people that are bonded like a family, which is what a nest is, really, is just a wonderful thing. It's kind of indescribable, because everything that you do is immersed in that. You know, you're reading the same books and watching the same TV shows and going out to the same movies and having everybody over for dinner and having salons and great discussions. It's just this ongoing vital life. And then for the seasonal events, you're decorating the house and throwing a great big festival for some particular occasion, you know, and you're, you know, celebrating the full moons and taking trips to sacred places. All the stuff that you can do as a group that one person has a harder time doing, you know, and even 2 people have a harder time doing. But when you've got a little dynamic group going on, it's amazing. So, yeah, daily life was, well, daily life. I don't know how else to describe it, really, because I don't have much of a basis of comparison, but it was pretty cool.
Can you tell me a little bit about Gray's School of Wizardry?
Oh, yeah. Well, as I mentioned in passing, back in 1962, when we started with our first water sharing and read the books, there was another very significant mythos that came out, in addition to Stranger in a Strange Land, and that was the Amazing X-Men. And during that particular time, I was deeply interested in education. I took every course they had in college in education and child development because I had a kid. I was the first student in the entire history of the school to get pregnant in school. Creates a bit of stir. But having independent housing and a kid, you know, changed a lot of my focus. And I was already in the field of psychology, so adding child development and education became a natural outgrowth of that. And I was fascinated by systems of education. Right about that time, the Montessori system was just coming to America. So my first wife became one of the very first teachers trained in the Montessori system. And our kid was one of the very first kids in America who had a Montessori school. And I got involved when I graduated in Head Start. I went to Teachers College and got a teacher's certificate, taught in public schools. But what seemed to really require attention at that time, as much as I was interested in educational reformation and new possibilities, I was interested in teaching for advanced kids. You know, the focus at that time was on the slower kids. But I was interested in the fast ones. And I made a tragic mistake when I enrolled in college, in Teachers College. I signed up for a course on teaching the exceptional child. And I had my concept of what exceptional meant. Apparently it was wrong. I thought exceptional meant better than average. Wow, that is exceptional. I learned a whole new meaning for the word exceptional that I can now apply when I see really bad art. And I talk to the artists and say, so what do you think I can say? That's exceptional. I actually do that. But I was interested in the advanced exceptional kids like me. Because I went to a regular school and I felt a lot of time like I was, you know, in a room with a bunch of chimpanzees, you know. I mean, what the hell am I doing here? I can't talk to any of these people. They don't know anything, you know. And part of my isolation, I was really a nerdy, geeky kid, you know. So about that time, but the religious Reformation that was presented in A Stranger, a Strange Land, which included lots more than just the surface stuff. For example, it introduced the idea of priestesses. Only pagan religions have priestesses. No other religion has priestesses. That was a big one. So when we incorporated the church as a legal church, we were able to legally ordain women, not as women priests or ministers, but as priestesses. It's huge, big thing. And ritual nudity was a big one. Some of the witchcraft covens were already doing that, so that fitted in nicely. But it was really a wonderful experience. You have everybody just sitting around naked. Once you get past the initial, look over it and just get into it, it's just this amazing, comfortable place to be. So there were lots of elements like that. So that became the focus. Creating a religious movement, a whole new religious perspective, seemed essential. And that's where my energy and devotion went for decades. But always in the back of my mind was other things. In fact, right in the very beginning, Lance and I had almost wanted to do this. We wanted to do a school and a church. And he wanted to head up the school, and I wanted to head up the church. So when he became heading up the Atlan Foundation, and eventually the Association for the Tree of Life, it was mainly devoted to ecological issues and stuff, and social issues. Lance was a first co-author of the first California Marijuana Initiative. He ran the street analysis program for UCLA, where people would come in with various drugs and they would tell them what was in them. When he moved to New Mexico with the other Atlan people who wanted to go with him, they followed the prescription in the Herod experiment into a low population state and got involved in various aspects of government and things. And he was the person who was able to establish the first medical marijuana laws anywhere, which was the use of marijuana for glaucoma in New Mexico. Lance was the guy who did that. He founded the Rural Ecology Corporation, dealing with ecological solutions to all the world's problems. And in his last years, he was an inspector for organic farms. He would travel around all over the place and check them out. So that was what he was doing. And most of that was kind of behind the scenes stuff, not obviously out there as part of something greater. But there was a whole lot of other people involved in that. And so that was what the Association of the Tree of Life did. His great magnum opus was putting out a huge document called the Renewable Deal that had solutions and answers to every conceivable problem that the world had, on everything. Here's the answer to that. This is how we can make that work and be better. So the school thing kind of sat on the back burner because we were busy until Harry Potter. And when the Harry Potter books came out, Maureen Glory and I got contacted by when the first movie came out, Maureen Glory and I were contacted by a Jewish shul in South San Francisco that wanted to have a witch and a wizard couple to come and talk to him about what witchcraft and wizardry was really all about before all the kids went to see the movie, because they were nervous. Are these kids going to be getting taught demonology or something? They didn't know what it was that. They had no idea. And somehow they found out about us, and we were the only witch and wizard around, as a couple. So we came down there in our full ritual regalia and a bunch of props, and talked about magic and witchcraft and wizardry, and did a few little neat things, and everybody loved it. And all the kids were there, and their parents were there, and the teachers were there. It was a wonderful thing. And afterwards, they had bought tickets for everybody to the opening night of the first movie. And they'd reserved the entire balcony of the theater. And so we were brought along. So we come down there, and we're wearing our full regalia, pointy hats and all, and looking around, and the whole place was full of pointy hats, only about this tall. And it was like, this is cool. This is a thing. We hadn't read the books. We didn't really know much about it except hearing about it, But we just didn't take it seriously. So there we are sitting up in the balcony watching a really cool movie. It's a great story. And all these kids down there, we had an insight. Say, this is so cool. Some of these kids are going to want to go looking for the real thing. And other stories about magic it's not accessible. It's somewhere through the magic wardrobe, or somewhere over the rainbow, or long ago in a galaxy far, far away, or something like that. But it's not accessible. Her setting was this world, and the presumption, the thesis of her mythos, was that among the regular mundane society, which she called muggles, we call them mundane, there are magical people that nobody notices because they just look like other people. Look around. right? You know, here we are, and you know, even in Salem, no less. But there is a society of magical people that move among regular people, and they have their own things, and their own gatherings, and their own stores, and their own festivals, and rituals, and places, and that's true, you see. So we went, wow. But we're not that hard to find. And if somebody goes looking, well, there's a store right up the block, another store right over here, and there's this place here, and there's a bulletin board there, and there's magazines and publications, and now websites. We're not that hard to find. But all of the magical groups, none of them admit anybody, they don't admit minors, because they don't want to get in trouble with parents and have people coming after them. So you have to be 18. But this series of books and movies was aimed at teenagers, at kids. So if they want to get into this stuff, where are they going to go? They're not going to get any information from the stories in the movies because there's no real stuff there. It's just a fantasy background for their adventures among each other. But there's no real magic, actually, the way we think of it. You know, they don't celebrate the Wheel of the Year or anything like that. They don't cast a magic circle. They don't show how to do things. Well, at that time we were making statues. That was all altar figures. And we got this flash. Well, the first thing you do when you put your foot on the magical path is you create an altar. First thing you do, set up a little altar that will put all your magical stuff and become the focus of your intention and things that you want to manifest in the world. You kind of set up like a little dollhouse, kind of a scene, sandbox kind of a thing. It's a model of the world you try to create as your altar. That's the first thing. So he said, well, we make altar figures. So let's make some kid altar figures. So I did a design, the kid god and goddess. It was sort of in a Disney style, you know, if I could win in a Disney cartoon thing. They're at the shop. You can see it when you go there. And we went to the New Age trade show that summer to market them. And that was our initial thing to do. And so for several years we were going every summer solstice to the New Age trade show in Denver. So we went and we took these. And while I was there, a friend of mine who has written a number of books introduced me to a publisher. She said, you got to get this guy to write books for you. He knows all kinds of stuff. And I've been written a lot because I published a magazine. I've gotten awards for favorite pagan author, but only for editorials and short pieces, you know. I'd never thought about doing a book. And so the publisher, Lori Kelly of the New Page Press, said, well, sit down here and tell me if you were going to write a book, what would you write about? I hadn't thought about it. So just off the top of my head, I say, well, I'd like to write a handbook of wizardry. You know, like the Boy Scout handbook kind of thing, that everything you want to know that you want to get when you put your foot on the path, like the Boy Scout thing, you know. I'm thinking more in terms of the Junior Woodchuck manual from the old Bob Barks Donald Duck series. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah, everything is like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that kind of a thing. So I wanted to do that. So I thought about this, and I kind of conceived it, and I'm spilling this idea out. It's just coming off the top of my head, really. And she said, that sounds great, send us a proposal. Well, to make a long story short, after a bunch of stuff, the book finally came out. And in the process of writing it, I said, well, I'm writing a textbook here for a school. This could be your fundamental textbook for Hogwarts, except that Hogwarts is just a movie and a fictional thing. So where would be the school that this would go? So that's when I started checking online. So, well, there must be some other schools of magic out there that I can then refer the kids to who've read the book. And I'm thinking this is a book for kids. I'm thinking teenagers are going to read this. So I'm orienting it like that. So I looked up everyone, and all of them had three qualities that didn't work. One is that they were all religious. They were essentially seminaries for different magical religious groups, mostly witches, a couple of druids, things like that. But they were training seminaries for their religion. And that wasn't what I was looking at. I was looking for something that everybody could do. It didn't have to be a religion. Wizardry isn't a religion. You know, wizards in every religion. In fact, most religions were founded by wizards. So the other one was that none of them admitted anybody under 18. I already mentioned that. So that kind of ruled out all the teenagers. And another one was that they were all very expensive, and I just didn't see any reason for that. So that became one of these little assignments that my life is wrapped around, is that periodically I get this, like a phone call, you know, metaphorically speaking, this is the goddess speaking, your next assignment, should you choose to accept it. And then I get this whole thing, okay, I got to do this thing. Because if I look out there and there's something that I really think should be, and it isn't, then I kind of feel, well, then I'm going to have to create it. It's pretty much been the basis of everything I've done, really. If somebody else had done it first, I wouldn't have had to. But nobody had done this. So I figured, well, if I got this textbook, I have to have a school that it can be the textbook for. So about that fall, I came to Salem for an event that was happening out here and talked to a few other people and began the process of creating a website that I fantasized, because I had absolutely no idea it was possible to do online. But I was talking to a guy who'd set up the website for the local Salem pagan community, and he was really quite clever. And we were sitting having lunch, and I started talking, and he said, I can do that. I can do that. I can make this happen. I can do that. I can set up a thing for classes. I can do this. And I said, cool. So, we officially incorporated the school on Pi Day, which is March 14th, 314 Pi. We're geeks, okay? We do that. And we officially opened the school at the 1st of August. At Lumicide, the virtual school, we opened our virtual doors, figuring we'd get a flood of teenagers. We were somewhat stunned to discover that 3/4 of the people signing up were adults. Because we thought this was going to be the same thing for the book. It turned out they started reading the reviews because the book came out as an instant bestseller for New Page, top of their list. And the reviews were from adults who were saying things like, well, I had to buy extra copies for my grandchildren because they were tearing mine apart, and things like that. And I'm hearing from people say, oh, well, that book is so good that we use it for our training program, for our whole coven or our group or whatever. And saying, wow. And I was thinking I was just talking to the kids here. So we had to reorganize and restructure. Today, the school population is about 4/5 adults and 1/5 teenagers. And doing great. We got students in 50 countries around the world and a couple of dozen teachers and over 600 classes in 16 departments. And it's thriving, and I'm really very proud of it. It's just, wow. So finally we got around to creating, and I get people think that I'm the real life Albus Dumbledore, but that's not actually it. I'm really the real life Charles Xavier in my own mind, because that's what I'm trying to do. That's kind of the school, and I think
Do you think it's more the school for the gifted than
Right.
Hogwarts?
Exactly.
School for wizards.
Yeah, it wasn't just about the magically talented. It was for the kids who were moving to the next stage of evolution, whatever that might look like, is what I was looking for. So, anyway, that's the thing.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Ecosophical Research Association?
Oh, yeah. When Morning Glory and I pulled up stakes from St. Louis on my 33rd birthday, taking the 33 mark is a mystical mark. I mean, that was the year that Jesus and Alexander the Great both died at, so it's got a certain mythical connotation about 33 years old. I quit my job that I was doing quite well at and bought an old school bus and spent the next several months fixing it up and building an interior of an amazing RV kind of a thing before there were such things. And
Hi, gentlemen. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I don't mean to keep bothering you. I'm just training, so I want to make sure everything's perfect for
thank
you
you.
guys.
Oh, we're all good. Thank you
Can
very
I
much.
grab anything else, or?
I think we're doing great.
Awesome.
I'm going to hit the road, visited people along the way, spent some time with Lance and LaRue, and connected with various folks. I ended up in California on a hippie community in Mendocino County of 6,000 acres and about 100 families that had been founded in 1972. And I've been out here in 72. I was there for the founding of that. I knew the people, but that's another whole story. And we ended up moving there. And because we had left the city, St. Louis, and all the stuff we were doing, much of what we left behind that we had been doing was not continued to be sustained. People tried. They kept the green egg going for a while, but gradually other people said, hey, I want to go to California too. they're out in California. Let's go out and join them, you know. So there was this whole migration. Tom Williams said he followed in his primates' knuckle prints, which I thought was a very amusing way of thinking about it. You know, but so we had kind of a brain drain, basically. We ended up there, but we didn't really reorganize a lot of this stuff because we were living out in the woods, and our big project was raising unicorns at the time. That's what we were focused on, and homesteading. We had to build a home in the country. It was just woods, you know. Build a home and plant gardens and trees and raise unicorns, and that took us out doing Renaissance fairs. So we really weren't in a position to do much more with the Church of All Worlds. And the printing press and all this stuff, we didn't take that with us in the bus, you know. So we left that behind. Things went on for a little while. They languished. But we eventually decided that a cool thing to do would be to set up different orders. Because one of the things that we'd done when we first organized the church, we got this clever idea that we wanted to use as a model the Catholic Church's model, because that was the best religious model that was unassailable. And so if anybody tried to challenge us or attack us on anything, we would have the legal corporate structure that would also mean they'd be attacking the Catholic Church's right to do things. So we got our corporation attorney, who was actually attorney for the St. Louis Catholic Church. And he set us up in the same model, which included being able to establish orders. You see, we were the only group that was set up to do that. And we figured that was a clever thing that happened in the Catholic Church. It enabled somebody like Francis of Assisi to, instead of being burnt at the stake, he could go off and found his own order. And that was a real good idea. So we started setting up all these orders. We set up Forever Forest to do tree planting and habitat restoration. And we set up the Holy Order of Mother Earth, home, to be our kind of a land-based, thing. We set up the poem, Peaceful Order of the Earth Mother, to do children's stuff. And we set up the Ecosophical Research Association to explore mysteries. It was kind of what it was about. It was a thing to get into weird stuff and take adventures and go on trips and travels. And the first thing we did with that was the Unicorn Project. That was the beginning of that.
But you already had unicorns.
Right. Well, it was parallel. As we were going through the process of setting up to do the unicorns, the same time that we put together the ERA, but it didn't really become official, actually, for a couple of years, because we first unicorns were born in 1980, but the ERA was officially established in 85. So there was a few years gap because we wanted to do other stuff. So, well, now that we've done that, what can we do next? Well, let's go search for mermaids in the South Pacific. Okay, now we're ready to actually have an organization, sort of like, ass kickers of the fantastic kind of a thing, But that was already a comic book, so explorers of the unknown, So we call ourselves the Ecosophical Research Association, New Era. We did acronyms, NEW, Naturalists Exploring Wonders, ERA, Era, Ecosophical Research Association. We like to play with that. We always would say that pagan was an acronym for People Advocating Goddess and Nature. So that was how the ERA came to be. So it's got a whole charter and everything in it. It's a subsidiary order of the Church of All Worlds to explore the fringes. So we've done a number of magical mystery tours to sacred sites, like Peru to Machu Picchu, or the mermaid expedition, or the unicorn adventures, or whatever else we think of that might be trying to explore the mysteries. We did a recreation of the Eleusinian Mysteries after our trip to Greece, which was pretty cool. And all that stuff came out of the ERA. And out of home, the Creating Circles and Ceremonies book came out from that, which has been hugely influential in the larger pagan community, because we laid out formulas and structures for creating ritual and ceremony that were not specifically witchcraft, which were the only ones that were really available to people before that. So, all these things.
What impact do you hope that call will have on society or the world in general?
Well, the criteria for achieving the ninth circle, the innermost circle in the Church of All Worlds, is to significantly impact the dominant paradigm. When I was first went off to school, one of the courses I took my first year as a freshman in college, I had a thing that we had to write a life mission statement. We do that all the time in school. And I came up with one that has stuck with me ever since, never changed. and that was to be a catalyst for the coalescence of consciousness. And so that has been my life mission. Everything I've done has been in pursuit of that mission. I added to serve the goddess in there after that revelation and other things that come along. In our Church of All Worlds mission statement is much more expansive now, but still that's at the core of it. So what I'd like to see our impact be is to continue to shift the dominant paradigm. When we first formed the Outland Water Brotherhood, our mission was to make the world safe for people like us. It seems simplistic, but actually we're still doing that. And the interesting thing about it is, since you've read the book, you know how it ends with the whole destruction of the whole thing, and then the people who have been following are scattered to go forth and continue, which by that time it's a magical charge that I've only seen 3 times that I'm familiar with in literature. One of them is at the end of Stranger Strange Land, where the reader himself becomes an agent to propagate the story. The other one was in Buffy the Vampire Killer TV series, where the final episode does the same thing, has her doing a magic spell to make every little girl in the world become a fierce warrior to defend the good stuff. And then you see the final scene, all these scenes of little girls around the world that are pulling out their katanas or putting on their little Tai Chi outfits and stuff like that. And the other one was the Disney movie Tomorrowland, which did the same thing at the end of the thing. So that's what Stranger Strangeland did. It sent everybody out to go and continue to this. So what I would like to see, in making the world safe, we have already changed the world. Consider this. The story was set 22 years after the first man landing on Mars. That's when the story begins. Well, we haven't done that yet. So right now they're talking about, well, the National Geographic, really excellent series, Mars, about the colonization of Mars, set it in 2033 as the first man landing. So let's take that as a date. Let's say that Elon Musk gets his expedition to Mars there by 2033. So supposing that a kid is born out of that first thing, which is not at all unlikely. A bunch of people go there, somebody's going to get pregnant. I can't imagine anybody going through space and not wanting to have sex in space, but they don't talk about that in the interviews with the astronauts. But that would sure be high on my agenda. The 1,000-mile high club, So, if you take that time frame and just project it on forward, the story cannot be set any sooner than, say, 2045. Well, right now, by 2018, we have changed the world so much that the Church of All Worlds itself, in its vision and its ideas and attitudes and practices, is already changed the world into an acceptance of all this stuff that precludes the possibility of angry mobs coming and burning the place down. Because we already have these places, and nobody's burning them down. And I think that's pretty significant, that in that interval, we've changed the world that much already. And we're not even there yet. Now they're planning to do a TV miniseries of Stranger Strangeland.
Oh, really?
Yes, which I'm very excited about. They've been talking about this, however, for 40 years. A movie, now a miniseries would be much better than a movie.
They came out with the movie The Martian, and I was wondering how much...
Nothing. No. The Martian was a NASA story. A guy who ends up being stranded on Mars from an expedition. They think there's a dust storm. This guy gets lost. They think he's been killed, and they have to take off because the dust storm is going to destroy their possibility of leaving. So the ship takes off to return to Earth, and they find out that this guy actually survived. And he gets back to the base that they had set up and has to somehow survive long enough until he can be rescued. And it's a wonderful Robinson Crusoe kind of a survival story, but it has nothing to do with Stranger Strangeland.
You mentioned polyamory a few times, and it sounds like you and the Church of All Worlds all together are pretty passionate about that being a fundamental idea or a fundamental doctrine.
I think it's part of our fundamental idea of inclusion. We're open to a lot of stuff that other groups aren't, that we've never discriminated against. I remember early on in the late 60s, early 70s, for example, a big issue in the witchcraft community was homosexuality, because they existing main traditions, Alexandrian and Gardnerian, were all about gender balance, polarity, boy girl in the circle, doing match up male female things, and a lot of everything was around that, the sexual polarity, and then we had gay communities coming up and say, well, we want to have just an all guys coven, and an all girls coven, or whatever it was, and there was a lot of controversy about that. And of course, it was never an issue at Church of All Worlds, so we kind of said, look, everybody, just do your own thing, and it's okay. Nobody has to tell anybody else what to do. There's other groups you can join that will do what you like to do, and it's up to you. It's all right. So that's kind of been the effort we've tried to make. Morning Glory and I were just always naturally polyamorous, and Stranger in Strange Lands discussion that provided a rationale, a reasonable rationale for loving multiple people. That's brilliant conversation there. Struck us, made sense to us. It was one of the things we really responded to, because we'd always felt that way. And when we first met each other, that was a big thing with us. Wow, we both feel this way. How cool is that? So it was always in the Church of All Worlds, in that it was in the book. But it wasn't that everybody necessarily did that. There was lots of stuff that's in the book that some people did, some people didn't do. But they were more common. Most of the nests, for example, were comfortable about nudity, for instance. So we could have skinny dipping, or we could have whatever. It was like okay, nobody freaked out. So, but we were just going on. We just had multiple orders. We ended up with a group marriage with Diane for 10 years, and we were publishing Reviving Green Egg at that time. This was in the 80s and 90s, and so we had a resurrection of the church after we came out of the woods and got a house and were living together and had our family. We ended up with 4 adults and 3 kids. Morning Glory's ex-husband Gary, who we introduced to Diane, and they got married, and she and me and Diane and Gary and our 3 kids. We had a wonderful family, really dynamic, and did all kinds of cool stuff. And at one point, somewhere, Morning Glory made some comment about some couple that were trying to do an open marriage, but were really screwing it up because they were being sneaky or lying or dishonest or something. And she said, well, they're just not following the rules. And Diane said, you're always talking about these rules. Why don't you write an article for Green Egg about it? And she said, okay, that would be a cool thing to do, just explaining, if you're going to have these kind of relationships, how can you do that without people getting hurt or pissed off or blowing up? And so she wrote an article called Bouquet of Lovers that became hugely influential. And in the process of that, she wanted to have the right language to describe this. And there was no appropriate language. The open marriage assumed you have a marriage. The opening. Words like polygamy, gammy means marriage. Everything that had gammy in it was marriage. We're just talking about not, multiple marriages, but just having multiple lovers. Maybe married, maybe not married. That's not the point. The point is just having multiple lovers. So she had to come up with a word that described that didn't exist. And so she came up with polyamory, which combined the Latin and the Greek, because doing it either other way didn't sound so good. If you'd just gone with the Greek, for example, it would have been polyphilia, which sounds like a disease and not something you really want to say. I'm a polyphiliac, I'm into polyphilia, they'd arrest you, so polyamory worked, the Greek and Latin, because multi-amory didn't sound so good either. So that was an amusing little thing. They made T-shirts that say polyamory is just wrong, and then on the back it says, you can't combine Greek and Latin. That's just not done. So it's become amusing. But by having a word, that inaugurated a movement. And we became kind of the pioneers and the first family of polyamory, and people started paying attention. We hadn't really thought about it. We hadn't tried to call attention to our stuff. We just lived that way, When Morning Glory and Diane and I all got together as a triad, Diane was still living in town, and I would go and spend the night with her, and then in the morning I'd go and make the rounds with her, delivering her carrot juice to the health food stores, and we'd have breakfast, and people would look at, Morning Glory, I'm not just, there's Oberon with Diane. Does Morning Glory know about that? I don't know. Oh boy, it must be a problem. And then And then, in the afternoon, Morning Glory would come into town, and she and Diane would go shopping or do something together, and they'd be having lunch. And, whoa, there's Morning Glory and Diane. They're both together. What does Oberon think about that? Then for dinner, I might come and join them. We'd be all going out for dinner or a show, and everything. We'd go, okay, whatever, But we hadn't really made a point about it or putting labels on it. It was just the way we were. And people just, okay, that's them. They got a group thing going, whatever it is. But by actually making a movement out of it, it put us in a different position. Then we had to give interviews and talk to people and give workshops and stuff like that. But it's been very effective. It's grown and changed. And so that was Morning Glory's qualifier for the Ninth Circle. It was the polyamory paradigm.
Nice.
Mine was the pagan paradigm and the Gaia paradigm, which I introduced.
So you and Morning Glory were married, though?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. We got married 6 months after we met at spring equinox of 1974.
And just to each other, but later you
Right. We expanded it later on. Right. Well, we had other lovers. But we didn't marry, and that's a big deal. That's lots of lovers, but actually getting the commitment to live together and to work together and to build a life together, raise kids together, that's a little bit more than just having lovers, That was where the marriage thing comes in. So we did that.
So marriage would be a more intimate relationship, a commitment to each other, as opposed to polyamory, which you love him, you can sleep with him,
Right.
all that kind of stuff. It's a little more relaxed, though, a little more low-key.
Well, it doesn't imply the commitment. It's just the opening up of the possibilities. That's all it is.
Like Stranger in a Strange Land.
Exactly like Stranger.
You get together, you move on, and
But on the other hand, that moving on doesn't necessarily mean that you will not be seeing each other again or get pissed at each other or call each other names,
not equated to a one-night stand,
Right.
but
Right.
yeah. Okay.
And because Morning Glory and I were both prominent figures in the larger pagan community because of publishing a magazine and writing articles and stuff, we got invited all over the country to workshops, to festivals and gatherings, to do presentations. And we would often meet people on these journeys that we would get involved with, And they might start off as a one-night stand, but mostly it was, well, you're pretty cool. Let me take you back home and meet my other partner, And we'd bring them back home, and sometimes they'd really hit it off, and sometimes we'd all end up being really close together. And now I have a network of lovers all over the world, really, that I've met over decades of time, and Morning Glory's gone now, and I'm, for the first time in my life, I'm alone in that sense. But I'm traveling, and part of that traveling is to actually visit some of these lovely ladies that I've known and being welcomed into, to visit with them. Sometimes it's a short visit, just a brief stay. In a number of cases, their lives are not in the place where they're exactly available in this time anymore, but that's okay because we still have our memories and fondness, and we're still very sweet on each other, And it's just a wonderful thing to have that. I don't have any pissed off, angry exes, that, after me with a rocket launcher or anything like that, So that's nice.
What's the difference between a wedding and a hand fasting?
Well, the hand fasting term comes from, it's a kind of a medieval term. When only nobility bothered to get married. I mean, you had to be married in the church by a priest, and it was a big deal. And every peasant couldn't do that. They didn't bother. They didn't care because it was all about property. And it was about insurance and the inheritance and the lineage and arranged marriages of state, and it was complicated stuff. That was marriages. But the common people who wanted to set up a household and raise a family together had a ceremony. It would be done in the village called a hand fasting. And it was just simply done. If there happened to be a village druid or somebody like that to help with it, or even maybe the local parish priest might officiate if that's what you got, or nobody at all, it could just be done, or the captain of the ship, or the justice of the peace. It really didn't matter. It didn't have to be a high church thing. So, and the major part of the ritual, there was two elements that were crucial. One is the binding of the hands together symbolically with a ribbon, and the other is jumping over the broom. So the one indicates, binding your lives together, and the other was establishing a new household together. And those are the simple core of the old hand fastening ceremony. Now, there's nothing that precludes that being also the base of a legal ceremony. If it's done by ordained clergy who can legally fill out the forms, then you get a marriage license stuff, that could be a legal marriage. But the ritual is a hand fasting ritual that we do. And that's done throughout the pagan community. And the Church of All Worlds was the first group to do that, because we were the first group to be legally organized and able to have legally ordained clergy, and therefore develop a legal rituals, because people came to us wanting us to do a wedding for them. So we had to make one up, and we put it together and made it happen.
So would you say the hand fasting is more of a ritual, where the wedding is more of a ceremony? Would that be accurate? That's not really true.
No, ceremony and ritual are the same.
Right. I'm trying to figure out, like a hand fasting can be part of the wedding, or it can be its own independent thing.
And the hand fasting can be a wedding. It's just, and many weddings now that are done in formal places are using elements of hand fasting because they're very creative. You've got whole new generations of liberal Unitarian ministers and women rabbis and things like that couples are coming to who want to bring in old customs and stuff. And so you find that the binding of the hands or the jumping of the broomstick can be widespread in lots of places. And but the distinction used to simply be whether it was illegally registered with the church and state or whether it was informal. And the primary difference in the ritual is only one phrase. And the phrase is the difference between "to death do you part" versus "as long as love shall last." And essentially, that's the only real distinction in the ceremony itself. Is that the legal church ceremony is "till death do you part." And you weren't allowed to have divorces and stuff.
So is there a permanence of marriage that doesn't exist in hand fasting?
Well, theoretically, the legal marriages were designed to be permanent because they were marriages of state. They involved property and inheritance and things like that. They had to be permanent. You couldn't just dissolve those. It became a big issue when Henry VIII decided he wanted to get rid of his other wives because they weren't producing any offspring. And he had to be able to pass on the offspring, but he couldn't just marry more of them because they didn't allow that. The marriage structure was designed to be monogamous. It was developed in Rome, actually. The whole monogamous marriage structure was a Roman thing for establishing political power, dynasties. And so it had to be that way. But now, married couples can get divorced, so it really is counting down to as long as love shall last. Marriages are not arranged marriages commonly, where people fall in love and decide they want to make a life together, and they get married. They may get married in an Elvis chapel in Vegas, It has nothing to do with any religion or anything at all, just because they've got a cool little chapel set up, and a preacher who's dressed up like Elvis Presley and sings a song or something. I don't know, but so the whole thing has gotten much looser, and these things are going to, but the origins were really quite separate.
So these questions, from reading your books and Stranger in a Strange Land and some of the stuff on the internet, these are questions that I came up with. But I'd like to know from you, to better understand you, to better understand the Church of All Worlds, what do I need to know? I guess, what is the center, the passion, what's the heart of it to better understand? And if there's nothing, that's fine. I didn't want to leave anything out that's important to you because of my ignorance.
Well, I feel, let me just try to play with this because I'm going to just have to run it off the top of my head. It's not a pre-thunk answer here. I think we are embodying the mythos of the age of Aquarius, the transition of the ages. The age of Pisces has now come to its end. And as of officially, winter solstice sunrise of 2012, we were tipped over into the new era. And it's different. The themes and the concepts and the ideas and the vision and the purposes and the agendas are different. The Piscean era was dominated by empire. From the Roman Empire, where it began, to the rise of the Holy Roman Empire and the Christian Church and the Islamic Empire. Everybody wants to rule the world, you know, and it's been a fierce one, and it's been a fierce thing dominated by everybody saying my one true, right, and only way is the only one, you know, and everybody else has to do what I say and follow this particular thing. But in the process of that, this global empire has spread around the world and has touched people everywhere. It's no longer just this isolated little valley or country somewhere that can do whatever it wants and doesn't matter, you know. And you used to have Catholic countries or Protestant countries, you know, the whole country would be. It isn't like that anymore. Now everybody's mixing it up, people all over the place. And that model doesn't work anymore, that unified imperial model. The dominionists are still trying to do that. The Islamic fundamentalists are still trying to do that. I mean, there's people, that's the model they want to have, but it doesn't really work for everybody. So there's a new vision, a different vision for Aquarius. But also, we are now approaching, well, a number of things. We are approaching the next phase of the 60-year Renaissance cycle. Every 60 years, like clockwork, back to the Italian Renaissance in the 1480s, there's been a cultural renaissance, a revolutionary culture, every 60 years, like clockwork. 1480s, Italian Renaissance. 1540s, Age of Exploration. 1600s, English Renaissance. Shakespeare, Elizabeth, Bacon. 1660s, the Scientific Revolution. Royal Academy founded 1660, Isaac Newton, all that stuff. Let's see, 1660s, 1720s, Great Awakening in Europe, inspired Benjamin Franklin. To the next one in the 1780s, which was the French and American Revolutions, the Age of Reason. 1840s, Transcendentalist movement, profound stuff, all this stuff. 1900s, Golden Dawn, the beginning of the Age of Magic. 1960s, you know, the psychedelic 60s, the entire revolution of religion and environmentalism, feminism, anti-war, all the movements that came from that, pagan movement. Well, 2020s, come right to it. So I think this is big, and each of these cultural eras has been shaped by a kind of a dominant paradigm, a mythos that's embedded in it. And the mythos for the age of Aquarius is established. We all have this vision of the Aquarian, you know, harmony and understanding, sympathy and truth abounding, no more falsehoods or derisions, all that's living dreams of vision, mystic, trustful, revelation, and the mind's true liberation, all that stuff, you know. And people have this. There's a certain feeling that people have about this stuff. So there's that. But this is also the time of the beginning of the great diaspora of humanity. You know, during this era, we will be taking humanity out there, out into the stars. We'll be colonizing other planets. You know, we'll be traveling to distant worlds and planting the seeds of Gaia on fertile soil and distant orbs, you know, around distant suns. Maybe encountering other beings, you know, maybe just, you know, I don't know, dinosaurs or whatever, or maybe human civilizations, who knows what we'll be encountering. We have no idea, because we're not there yet. But it's out there, something's out there, and we're going to go out and find it. That's going to be pretty exciting. And in order to do this, we have to evolve a cultural mythos that's big enough. Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, said in his last book, The Power of Myth, he said, it is time for a new myth that includes everybody, the whole world, without boundaries or nations, because we can no longer live by myths that are limited to just, you know, our people versus everybody else. You know, all the old names for people translate out as the people, you know, whatever it is. That's because, and the names for other people simply translated for not human, because it was based on language. If you couldn't understand their language, they were just barbarians, right? That's what the word comes from. So we don't do that anymore. You know, it's all changing radically, drastically. The internet has become a global noosphere, like Teilhard Chardin talked about, a planetary brain awakening, you know. The awakening of the planetary consciousness is a big thing and a big part of the myth. I've traveled all over the world, and I've talked to shamans and leaders of communities from every culture, from Africa and South America and Siberia and Australia, Outback. I've been to all these places and I've talked to these people. And there's a common theme that all of them share. And when I come back to the film, I was just at the Toronto thing and I talked to the indigenous peoples there. They had a big longhouse thing and they did the thing and I got up and said this. And that common thing is the awakening. This is the time of the awakening. The theme for this time is awakening. And all the Indians at the conference in Toronto were all, yes, that is it. All the medicine people say this. So the awakening of planetary consciousness, I mean, it's an organism the size of a planet. It's going to wake up, and consciousness is a part of life. The two important elements are just universally part of life. One is consciousness. All life has that. And the other is the urge to reproduce. How does a planet reproduce? So these are the kind of things that I think are themes that the Church of All Worlds is in a unique position to bring, because we're a religion that's based on a mythos not only of the golden age long past that we draw inspiration from, but a golden age yet to come that we are creating with our vision and our inspiration. So we are in the middle of this continuity that reaches towards the past and towards the future. And I don't think that there's any